Hello, everyone, and welcome to chapter number 5 of this Flutter course. In this chapter, we're going to talk about null safety. In the previous chapter, chapter number 4, we talked about Dart control statements and collections. And before we go on to talk about enumerations and objects and classes, I feel it is very important to talk about null safety, which is a concept that is available in most modern languages, such as such as Rust and Swift. So it is important to kind of like get this out the way before we continue. Maybe not even get it out the way, but actually like learn what it means and try to utilize it so that we can write better code. So I thought to just bring up the concept of null values and why they're important to handle. Well, I mean, you've seen so far that we have data types. A data type can be, for instance, a string, can be an integer, and then you can put values in them. However, in programming languages, you're also allowed to have the concept of the absence of a value. So on one hand, you have values. So you, for instance, have a string value equal to foobar or your name or whatever it is. And then on the other hand, you can have the absence of that value. So you can see that, okay, I have a container, I have a variable that can contain the values of type string, or I have a variable that can contain any object. However, at the moment, I don't have that value. So you will just tell Dart that this variable that I have right now can either contain a valid value of type object or of type string or integer, or it can sometimes also, during its lifetime, contain nothing. And this nothingness is the concept that is known as null. So it's null in Dart is a keyword. It means that it's a word that you can just write in your text editor as you're writing your code, and you say that a variable's value is equal to null. And this tells Dart that, well, okay, this variable at the moment doesn't contain any values. So null is not really a value, but is actually the absence of a value. You should think of it that way. So let's have a look at this. There's a little bit of a documentation here on Dart's website, Dart Dev null-safety. So I'm just going to click on it. You're not going to see my screen at the moment. I'm just bringing it up in a browser window. I'm going to bring it on the screen and increase the size a little bit, and also change the sizing on the window as well, so you can see the contents in its entirety. So as you can see in Dart, it's called sound null safety, and there's documentation about what this actually means. We're going to look at what null safety actually means in Dart, and I'm going to give you a lot of examples of what that actually practically means. And there's documentation here in Dart's website simply because Dart, in its older versions, not in its current versions, in its older versions, it didn't support null safety. So there was a lot of code written manually by programmers in order to, for instance, check whether a value is absent in a variable. And then there is, as you can see here, it says migrating an existing package or app. So there is documentation written by the Dart team in order to help developers understand how they can move their old code to the new code that supports null safety. However, if you're following along with this course and it's like you're basically just following chronologically from chapter 1 to all the other chapters. I don't know how many chapters we're going to have, but if you're following along with this course, you don't have to think about migrating, because the code that we're writing in this entire course is going to be null safe, meaning that we're going to take advantage of Dart's null safety operators, and meaning that we are not going to manually check for values being null and then doing some branches of code, whether they're null or not. But so what I mean is that if you read the documentation for sound null safety, you don't have to worry about the migration parts. Just read the rest, okay? So with that out the way, I'm just gonna make sure that I tick that in my notes here. That's why I'm looking in this direction, because I have all my notes here. Let's close this window and bring up our Visual Studio Code window that we had from earlier. I'm gonna put it here, and I'm just gonna ensure that it is of the correct height as well. So you're gonna see the window in its entirety. Okay. So now that we talked about what non-values are and that they're the absence of a value, let's have a look at making any type nullable. And if you follow along with the course up to this point, you should have some sort of a simulator or an emulator running, and then you should have done Command Shift P or Control Shift P, depending on your operating system. Command Shift P in Mac and Control Shift P in Linux and Windows, in order to bring up this menu, and then you can just type Flutter, select device, and then you just select the device that you want to run the code on. So I'm kind of assuming that you've already done that and that your code is running. And this is something that we talked about in earlier chapters, so we're not going to go through that again. So I have an iPhone simulator, which you cannot see on the screen, but I have it running in a separate screen just because we don't have enough real estate. I can bring it up to this window, but it will just take a lot of space. So I'm going to bring it up to another monitor so you don't see it. So this code at the moment is running live. So if I press Command S, then it's going to run it and just print the output for us, okay? Now, let's talk about making any type nullable. And there is a way to do that. Let's have a look here. We talked about that null is a keyword, and that's why you can see it is like highlighted here in a different color. So if you, for instance, say final name is foo, all right, as you can see, it says, okay, I accept this. His name is foo. But you can't just say name like is a null, because then it doesn't understand. Is it an object? Is it a string? Is it nil? Is it integer? And if you type here name, then you see it's just dynamic. It doesn't understand the type. So, and we'll talk about dynamic a little bit later. But what you can do is to actually specify that, okay, I want a string data type that it can contain normal names or strings, as we call it, like series of characters, or it can sometimes be null. And in that case, you have to actually specify the data type as not just string, not just this, because you'll see you'll get an error. And you'll actually get a suggestion. It says try changing the type of the variable or casting the right hand type to string. But we're not going to do that. That wasn't such a useful suggestion, because what you want here is to actually make Dart understand that this variable right here, or this constant right here, can sometimes contain the value of null. And the way to do that is you put a suffix after your data type as a question mark. So this is the syntax, which is actually used in some other languages as well. It's used in Swift as well. So this tells Dart that, well, here, if we make it actually a variable, as you can see, or sorry, like this. So you say, I have a variable, is a string, but sometimes the string value may be absent. And then you'll just say, okay, now name is foo. And you can say now name is null. So this is kind of like resetting out names. So if I just say, okay, print name, and then after foo, I say print name. Okay. So let's just clear the console and just run this application. You can see the first time it says it's null, and then the second time around it says it is foo. So this is how you tell Dart that you want to have nullable data type. And you can do this with pretty much all data types. So you can just say, okay, I have an integer of age, and that's 20. But you can see you cannot now assign the value of null to integer, because it's not nullable. But as soon as you make it nullable, then that is accepted. So, and of course, you can do different operations using, for instance, in the previous chapter, I believe we talked about control statements, if and else. So you can say, for instance, if age is 20, and then you can execute some code. Or you can say if age is null, execute some code. So they work as you would expect. So there is no difference really. And I mean, if you think about that, nullability is just like a suffix to a data type. You can also say, okay, pretty much any data type can be nullable, and that's correct. Like for instance, if you have a list of string of names, and you can say, okay, I have foo and bar here. This is a list of strings. We talked about lists in chapter 4. Now you can see here that list of strings, there are two data types here: the list itself and the contents that it holds. So if you want to make the list in itself nullable, then you would put the question mark after. Okay, this means this list of strings in itself can be absent. So you say name is null, and that's accepted. All right. However, since you're telling Dart that, okay, the name's value here can in its entirety be null, but its values are not supposed to be null. So if you then go in here and just put null in here, then you see that you got an error. And that's because Dart is saying that, okay, you just promised me that the list in itself, it can be absent, but as soon as it is not absent, meaning that as soon as it is present there, with some values, its values cannot be null. And that means that this type should be string. You're telling me here that it is null. So if you want to make an optional or nullable list of optional strings, then you would put the question mark after the data type of string as well. So this is now, I mean, the way you should read this is I have a list of strings and I call that list names. Names can sometimes be null, meaning that it can be absent. And if it is not absent, it can contain objects of type string that themselves can sometimes be absent. Meaning that, okay, like for instance, if you say foo bar null, that's accepted, but you can also say names is null. See what I mean? So both the container, which is called names, and the values that it contains can be optional. And the word optional is very important for you to learn. It's kind of like a industry accepted way of talking about nulls and nullable values. So this is optional. All right. Okay. Now we talked about that, nullable values and optional values. All right. Basically, you can use those words interchangeably. So if you're talking with a colleague programmer, you would say, oh, how would you describe this? Okay, this is an optional list of optional strings. Or you could also say nullable list of nullable strings. But optional is also a word that is typically used to talk about nullable values. All right. Okay, we talked about making any type nullable. So I'm just going to mark that as done, that we've talked about it in notes. All right. Now let's talk about cherry picking non-null values. And what this means is um, with Dart, you can easily ask the language to give you values that are not null. And I will explain what this actually means. Let's say that you have um, a string final string first name and is equal to foo. Okay. And let's just say this is a constant. All right, that's what the suggestion was. You see, I wrote final because I was not planning to reassign this first name value to anything else, but then I got a suggestion to actually use the word final here, or the keyword final. Sorry, the keyword const, as you can see here. So let's say const. All right. Now, what we want to do here then is to also create a last name or middle name, R, and then we say last name as. Okay? And actually, what we're going to do is we're going to say the first name is null. All right. So first name null, middle name bar, and last name baz. Now, if you want to, if you have these values and you want to, for instance, I mean, right now you can actually see the values that you put here, but sometimes these values are passed to your function. So you don't know what they are. Right now you can see what they are. So it's easy. If I told you pick the first non-null value, then you would say middle name because you can see it. However, if you had a function, for instance, test here that accepted those values, for instance, string first name, string last name, and then string middle name, etc., then you wouldn't know what those values are, or you cannot make an assumption about what those values are, except that they are nullable or optional strings. So I hope that you get what I'm trying to say. Now, if someone told you to pick the first non-null value, one way to do that is, like the old way of doing that is to say, for if first name is not null, then you would say, oh, then okay, I know. First name is the first non-null value, okay? And then you say, okay, if first name isn't null, then we pick it. Otherwise, else if middle name is not null, okay? And then you say, okay, middle name is the first non-null value. And then else if, again, so last name is not null, then you would print the same thing. So this is very repetitive. And it's basically, so it is basically very verbose in the way it is created. There is a better way of doing this, and that is with the question mark operator in Dart, which is available in some other programming languages such as Swift as well. So the way to do that then is you would want to pick the first non-null value. So you would say final or const first non-null value, and you would say that's equal to first name or. So this is kind of like question mark middle name, and then question mark last name. So, and I mean, we're getting a warning here just because Dart understands already that this middle name, although this is although an optional, basically it has a value. But if we made this null, so, and that warning goes away. But I mean, it would probably be cleaner if we actually pass these as parameters into this function so we don't get these weird warnings. But the way the question mark operator is working is that it says it is an infix operator. Just so you know, in from chapter 4, you know, an infix operator is an operator that has two things, one on each side, the right and left. So in this case, on the right side we have middle name, and on the left side we have first name. So what this operator does is says, if the value on my left side is null, I'm gonna pick the value on my right. Okay. And let's now, in this case, say, okay, middle name is not null. So what it does is says, first name, are you null? Yeah, you're null. Then I'm going to go to the right side. Middle name, are you null? Nope, I'm not null. Then it's going to pick that, and the rest of the statement is not going to be executed. However, if middle name was also null in this case, then what happens is that it begins from the left. It says, first name, are you null? Yes. Middle name, are you null? Yes. So this entire operation here, it doesn't yield any value. And then, so this entire operation will then be null. So it says, okay, now I have to compare our left-hand side, are you null? Yeah, we know that this entire thing was null. And then it says right-hand side, are you null? Nope, I'm Baz. Then it picks Baz. So this question mark operator is a null-aware operator that picks either the left side or the right side, whichever one is not null first in that order. So left side, are you null? If you're null, I go to the right side. But if you're not null, not null, I'll pick you. So keep that in mind. It is a very handy operator, and it will shorten your code quite a lot. All right. Now, if we then go in here and say first non-null value, you can see it actually says, oh, it's a string. However, if these were parameters, so if we said first name and then string last name, middle name, string last name, so they were not provided to us like that, const variables, okay, and then we say final. Okay. Now, if we say first non-null value, in this case, since it is a normal case, excuse me, where the Dart compiler isn't working with constants, then it cannot resolve this to a constant value at the moment. So it says, okay, there are 3 optional values. I have no idea what they are. So I'm going to do my best to pick the first non-null value depending on, based on what we've provided here. However, I may not be able to solve this. So the final result here, as you'll see, is an optional string, meaning that, well, I may not be able to resolve this, meaning that this entire operation on top on line 9 may result in a null. All right. Sorry about that. Sorry about my voice. So that is the question mark operator. So I'm just gonna mark that we talked about it in my notes. Okay. So that was that. Now let's talk about the next topic, which is the null-aware assignment operator. And I think that's its actual official name. This operator is very similar to the question mark operator in that it tries to resolve a variable to make sure it is not null. It's going to do its best. And let's have a look at an example. Let's just say bar, and I'm going to say, actually, let's just say string, and name is first name. So we say that we have an optional name, and we begin by assigning first name to it. So it means that this name might, at the moment, depending on the value of first name, it may be null. Now, if that is null, you may want to assign another value to it, all right? And then you can do that with this operator. You would say last name. Let's see what happened here. We'll try and change it. Oh, is it this? Yes, it is equal to. So I actually should change this case to equal to question mark. This, and I'm going to bring it up again so that it is actually correct. Let's say. And then name equal to, isn't this working? Last name. Oh, or was it this one? Try changing the, is it like this? I'm actually a bit unsure right now. So let's have a look actually what this does. And it's 3 positional, and then we say null, 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 and then bar, and then baz here, okay? So first name is null, middle name is bar, and last name is baz. And to be honest with you, this is quite a lot for me as well. It is something that is like the syntax of the programming language. It is something that you will kind of need to live with. You're not going to memorize this all just in your head all the time. Of course, like the main parts of it, you're gonna remember, but not all of it. So, and you can see for me as well, I'm just like at the moment, okay, which one is it? So I'm going to test that. So to begin with, we say name is first name, and if that is null, then assign, actually, let's just say middle name here, then use middle name, and then print the name finally. And I can see it says bar here, so it's actually question mark equal. So I actually maybe need to edit this text one more time. So I'm just going to say question mark equal. Bring it up because I think question mark equal is not going to work, and equal question mark isn't going to work either. It's not a value. It's not a valid syntax. So question mark equal. Sorry about that. So what this operator at the moment is doing is says that I'm going to take the value on the left-hand side and check whether it is null or not. If it is null, then I'm going to assign the value on the right-hand side to the left-hand side. If it is not null, I'm going to leave it alone. Okay? So at the moment, first name, as you saw here, is null, the first parameter that we pass here. So what it says, okay, I'm going to check then for middle name if name is null, and it is null. And then it says, okay, middle name, are you like present there? And then we'll assign that value here. So it will be, basically it will be bar, which is the value of the middle name. Now, if we in here said middle name is also null, right? You could have another operator here that says, okay, if after taking the middle name we are still null, then take the last name. So, and you can see Baz gets printed to the screen. And that is because Baz is the last parameter that we're checking on line 10, and its value is not null. So you can see how, like, if I then went here and actually said the first name is bar, then you will see that that will be the value that gets printed to the screen here. Because right here, name or first name, which is bar, got assigned to name. So it is an optional string, but it has a value, which is bar. Then when you come to this line number 9, then you're telling Dart, look, if name is null, then assign middle name to it. And Dart says, well, name isn't null, it is bar. So I'm not going to assign middle name to it. And then it goes to line number 10 and does the exact same thing. All right. So that is like the null-aware assignment operators. And it is useful. I personally, I mean, to be honest with you, as you could kind of guess, I don't use this operator so often. It is there. And I have no shame in saying that pretty much in none of my programs have I had to use this. So it is present for you to use. It is available if you want to use it. So just don't be like me, but try to remember the syntax is question mark, equal. Okay. And I'm gonna actually fix that in my notes as well, that it is question mark, equal. Okay. And I'm gonna check it in the notes that we've talked about it. Now let's talk a little bit about conditional method or property access or conditional invocation. Now, as we talked about in the previous chapter, with Dart, as like many other programming languages, you can use the dot syntax in order to access or drill down inside properties and methods or functions inside other objects, as we saw, for instance, with the case of lists in Dart. You can say, I have a list, and then you want to get its length. Then you would say the name of the list dot length, and that drills down inside that list and gets the length property. Okay. However, as you saw also earlier in this chapter, in chapter number 5, even lists or pretty much any data type in Dart can also be nullable. So how do you access properties of a null object? So let's have a look at that now. Let's say I'm gonna actually delete these properties, the parameters that come here to our function. And I'm gonna go down here and remove these parameters as well. And in here, let's just create an optional list of strings, not optional list of optional strings, but just an optional list of valid strings. Okay, so I'm just gonna say list of strings as an optional list, and I'm just gonna say names, and that is equal to, let's just say at the moment, foo. All right. Now, in here, if you try to say final length of names or number of names is names length, okay? If you then look at the data type here, I mean, we could actually say this is null, okay? And you can see here, Dart actually is allowed to, or is able to give you an error knowing that this list is null at the moment. However, if you accept it, I think it's actually better that we accept this value as a parameter so that Dart analyzer cannot be too smart about like making assumptions about what this actually is at the moment. So you can see the analyzer is telling you it cannot be unconditionally accessed because the receiver can be null. And that means, yeah, exactly as it says names can be null. I don't know if it's null right now or not, but it can be. So how do you access that? One way to do that, like the old way of doing that, is to say if names is not null, then length is names length, okay? Final length is names length. Okay, so that tells Dart that, look, I'm actually checking for null values, or I'm checking that this list is not null on line 8. And if it is not null, then I will access its length property. And this is kind of, it's called type promotion, type as in data type. So in this case, you can see on line number 8, or now if I go and create a new line on line number 8 and I say names, this is an optional list that can contain strings. And in here, you can see it is typed as the same, but it is promoted to not being null because you've already checked for it. Because if you remove these lines of code, you can see now that you get an error, the exact same line. But if you check first for null, then you don't get the error. It's a type promotion, okay? So this is kind of like the old way of doing that. So let's say that you want to extract the length. So you say final length or int length, right? You create the variable, but you don't assign anything to it. Then you say if names is not null, then the length is equal to the name's length. Otherwise, length is 0. Okay? So this is one way of doing that. It's the old way of doing that. And you may be trying to be smart as well and say, okay, I don't need this else statement if I just say this is a variable and by default is 0. And yeah, you would be right because length is 0 by default. And then if names is not null, then you say, okay, length is equal to name's length. However, there's a better way of doing that, and that is using the dot question mark, I believe, or the question mark dot, actually it is, yeah, operator, which conditionally executes or invokes a method or a property inside an optional if that optional value is present. And I'm going to show you how to do that. So if we say final length is names, and then you would put question mark dot, and then you would say a length, and you would see this code like being executed without a problem. However, if you go here, you would see that length is an optional value, is an optional integer. So you may be like, okay, how do I solve that? How do I say that I want length to be 0 if this length value is null, meaning that if it's names, if the names list is null and we can't extract the length, then I want this value to be set to null. And that is using our question mark operator that we talked about, the null-aware operator that we talked about earlier, the infix operator. So you could just do this. You would say length is, if the names list is present, meaning that its value is not null, then grab its length. Otherwise, take the value of 0 and assign it to length. And if you go to line number 9 now, and I say length, you can see it's an integer. So it's not is not an optional integer anymore. So you could do the same thing as well. Like you could say names, and you could do the same thing with properties, and you could also do it for functions. So you can say names add as, right? So you see this is a function called add, and then we're adding the value of baz to that list. However, you can't unconditionally invoke this function on an optional value because it might be null. All right. So that is like a very, very important bit of learning about Dart, learning about optionals in Dart, how you could use nullable values. And as you will see, and we'll talk about it more in this course, there is many cases where you have to take into consideration null values. And especially if you're working with different libraries where the library cannot make too many assumptions and your code is dependent on that library, and you will have to take into consideration, okay, the absence of a value means that I personally have to like take some decisions in my code consciously in order to execute bits and pieces of code depending on the absence or presence of the value. So try to use these optional null-aware operators that I taught you here, which was the null-aware, basically like the decision making on to pick like the infix operator that tells you whether the left hand side or the right hand side, depending on which one is not null first. It picks that one. Okay, that operator is very important, and the null-aware invocation operator, which is here. So you say some object which may be null, then do something on it, or the operator, which is a null-aware assignment operator that assigns the value on the right to the variable on the left should the variable on the left be null. All right. So these are very, very important to understand. Okay. Now that we've talked about that, I'm gonna take that in my notes. That is a topic we talked about. Now, we also have very, very good official documentation about null safety in Dart. So I'm gonna bring up this documentation on a separate screen, and then I'm going to bring it up here so you can actually see as well. All right. You can see here it says understanding null safety, and this is great documentation about how null safety in Dart works. As you can see, a lot of examples. I mean, it talks about like from the absolute beginning, what it actually means, and you can see here null is at the level of object, so it's not null in itself is not like an object. So you have lists and doubles and integers here, but null sits on top for itself. It's kind of like the absence of a value. So there's lots of examples in this link, and I highly encourage you to have a look at it. Some things you may not understand, for instance, like this one you will understand easily because it says there is something called a thing, like a class, but we haven't talked about classes yet. And its parameter name here in this function called show gizmo is called thing. And you can see it is conditionally accessing a property on that thing. So, and then if that property in itself is null, it conditionally accesses that as well. So this property is nullable, and then it's accessing another property inside that nullable property if it's not null. So it's, I mean, it's a great way you can chain them, as you can see here. So if this thing is not null, then conditionally accesses this property on that. So it's beautiful. I mean, and this thing is available on many other languages like Rust and Swift as well. So it's nothing new, but it is kind of like such an important topic to understand in Dart that I think you shouldn't just skim over it. So you should just really learn how to work with it. So all right, we've now talked about null values, so I'm going to take that in my notes here. Now, I think for chapter 5, this information is enough so that we can move on to the next chapter. And in the next chapter, chapter number 6, we're going to talk about some really juicy stuff. And this is like chapter 6 is going to be like as I can see in my notes, I've pressed in a lot of really interesting topics such as enumerations, classes, objects, custom operators, constructors, factory constructors, class methods. I mean, inheritance and subclassing, abstract classes. So as you may have heard, depending on what background you have, you may be like a product owner or product designer, a UXer or whatever. You may not have like a software engineering background, but Dart is, in its core, is an object-oriented programming language. It means that things in Dart are objects. An object is an instance of a class, as we'll talk about in the next chapter. So, for you to understand Dart and how these things work, for instance, we've talked about lists and actually typing a dot in front of the name of the list and getting its length, but you may not really know how that works. So in order to understand all those things, what that dot means, you need to understand what objects are. And in order to understand objects, you need to know what classes are. And when you understand classes, then you will learn about inheritance, and then we'll talk about abstract classes, properties, static functions, all that. So what we're going to talk about in chapter 6 is so important that I believe that every Dart developer needs to know about this. And we're learning all of these things to be become good at doing Flutter. Although you can go and write like servers, maybe server applications with Dart, or you could write command line applications with Dart, but these days Dart is primarily used for writing Flutter applications. And I don't have any data to prove that, but I can see for myself when I'm in the community that most people are using Dart primarily to write Flutter applications. So we're doing all of this to learn more about Flutter. And I highly recommend that you don't skip these chapters where we're talking about Dart, especially if you're new to Flutter development. So with that said, let's leave this chapter the way it is right now. Chapter number 5, we're done with that. Let's go to chapter number 6 and learn about Dart enumerations and objects.